Sarah Whitmore was only 19 when her world, already too quiet since the tragic death of her parents, completely collapsed on her shoulders. The house she lived in now, an old mansion with cold walls and empty hallways, belonged to her relatives Charles and Diana Lancaster, distant family members she had barely known as a child, but who, after the accident that took her parents, became her only legal guardians. But there was no warmth in that house. Only rules, only silence. Sarah walked on tiptoe all the time, as if even the sound of her footsteps could bother someone. Diana, always strict, had no tolerance for any sign of sensitivity. Charles, on the other hand, avoided any direct interaction with his niece, as if her presence reminded him of a burden he preferred to ignore. The grief of losing her parents was still raw. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear her mother's soft voice calling her for breakfast, or her father's deep laugh when he pretended not to know how to fold a shirt. But reality always came back, cold, harsh, unchanging. And each morning was just another day filled with absence. For weeks, Sarah tried to find some kind of comfort in that house. She planted small flowers in the side garden, read a few old books she found in an attic cabinet, wrote letters to her parents that would never be sent. She searched for ways to stay human in a place that treated her like she didn't exist, until one overcast afternoon, with sharp winds blowing through the windows, her life changed again, and not by her own choice. Diana called her into the main room. Sarah walked slowly down the dark wooden staircase, her fingers brushing the cold handrail. She found her aunt and uncle sitting in formal armchairs, and a stranger in a dark suit standing near the unlit fireplace. "Sarah, this is Mr. Nathaniel Reed," Diana announced, her voice as cold and impersonal as if she were reading a bank statement. The man looked up. He seemed to be in his late 40s, maybe a bit younger, tall, with perfect posture, and grey starting to show at his temples. His gaze was steady but distant. There was no kindness in it, nor arrogance, just neutrality, as if he were there to finalize a deal, because that's exactly what it was. Sarah looked at her aunt and uncle, confused. What's going on?" Her voice came out lower than she wanted. Charles cleared his throat, already sounding impatient. "We're doing what's best for you. Girl, Mr. Reed is a respectable man, a business owner with an impeccable reputation. He's willing to take on the responsibility." "Responsibility?" Sarah whispered, feeling the ground shift beneath her. "The wedding will take place next month," Diana added, adjusting a bracelet on her wrist with complete indifference. "You'll be well taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything. He's already offered a generous amount to help us maintain this house. Everyone wins." Sarah's eyes widened. "This is a contract." "I can't. I don't love this man. I don't even know him." Nathaniel said nothing. He just stood there observing. His face showed no emotion at all, neither approval nor rejection. Charles stood up, clearly irritated. "Listen carefully, girl. You have nowhere to go, no way to support yourself. We took you in out of charity, and now it's time for you to give something back. Don't think you have a voice here. There are no other options." Sarah's throat went dry. The word choice echoed in her ears like a cruel joke. It was as if they had ripped her life out of her hands again. First her parents, now her future. Freedom had never belonged to her. That night, she locked herself in the old guest room, where she had been sleeping since she arrived. The wallpaper was faded, and the only window looked out over the garden she had tried so hard to keep alive. She lay down on the bed and cried silently, her face buried in the pillow. The idea of being handed over to a stranger was unbearable. Sarah had always dreamed of love, even in the hardest times. Real love, the kind that truly sees you, not with castles or fancy dresses, but with affection, with honest touch, with genuine connection. Now all of that felt like a cruel joke. In the days that followed, the wedding preparations moved forward without her consent. Diana picked out dresses. Charles signed papers. Nathaniel sent discreet invitations, keeping the ceremony intimate just as he preferred. Sarah was ignored in every decision, a puppet with no say in her own fate. She tried once more to plead her case. She found Diana in the library and begged, eyes filled with tears, "Please, don't do this to me. But the response was sharp as a blade. "You should be grateful. If it were up to me, you'd have been sent to a boarding school overseas. But Nathaniel insists on treating you with respect. So accept it and act like a proper Lancaster." Sarah returned to her room with a heart in ruins. That night she thought about running away, about writing to some institution, about disappearing, but where would she go? Who would believe her? And even if she managed to escape, how would she survive? She was just a young woman with no money, no contacts, no ground to stand on. The wedding day was set for a winter morning. Cold, pale, silent. The wedding dress felt like it weighed a ton on her shoulders. It was made of pure silk, with hand-sewn details. But no luxury could hide the emptiness inside her. In this small yet luxurious church Nathaniel had rented, she walked down the aisle like a prisoner being escorted. Each step echoed like a sentence. Nathaniel stood at the altar, impeccable, hands calmly clasped, his expression unreadable. When the priest asked if she accepted, for a split second Sarah wanted to scream no, to run, to tear off the dress, to throw away the veil. But the image of her unyielding uncle, Charles's harsh voice, the fear of being thrown out into the world, it all silenced her soul. She said yes, and in that moment, though she was surrounded by flowers and promises, something inside her died. Not because of Nathaniel, who had barely even spoken to her until then, but because of the feeling of being treated like a product, as if her life had been sold on a silver platter. That's how it began, but what no one knew, not even Sarah, nor Nathaniel, was that this forced marriage, born from fear and loneliness, still had many unexpected chapters to unfold. That day, the sky seemed to reflect exactly how Sarah felt inside. A heavy grey blanketed the entire city, like an opaque veil that erased any trace of joy. The morning of the wedding began in silence, and even the birds in the garden seemed to have given up singing. Sarah woke up before the alarm went off. She hadn't really slept. It was as if her soul had sensed that this would be the last day of the life she knew, even if that life had never truly been free. When she opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was blurred by silent tears that streamed uncontrollably. Her breathing was short, tense, her chest tight, as if her ribs were closing in around her heart. The house was already bustling, the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices exchanging instructions, the metallic clinking of silverware being arranged for the celebration lunch. None of it was for her. It was for appearances, for status, to keep up the illusion that everything was under control, so the Lancasters could get rid of their problem and still walk away looking good. A team of hairdressers and makeup artists arrived just after 8. They entered her room without knocking, smiling as if this were the happiest day of Sarah's life. They asked if she was excited. They gushed about how stunning the dress was, how respected, powerful, and generous Nathaniel Reed was. Sarah responded only with small gestures, her eyes distant, not that anyone noticed. The truth was, no one cared what she felt. Everything had already been scripted. The sad bride was just an insignificant detail in a game where money, reputation, and convenience made the rules. When they finally dressed her, she barely recognized the image in the mirror. The gown was beautiful, a pearly white with delicate lace, a cinched waist and a flowing skirt. Her hair was pinned in a classic bun, her makeup light enough to hide the dark circles from her sleepless night. A picture-perfect bride, but in her eyes there was pain and loneliness, as if she were attending a funeral disguised as a celebration. "You look perfect," Diana commented as she entered for a final check. "Do your part, smile for the pictures, and everything will go smoothly." Sarah just nodded. Inside, it felt like she was saying goodbye to herself. The church was a historic estate Nathaniel had restored just for the occasion. Light marble columns, towering stained-glass windows, hand-carved wooden pews. Everything was flawless, elegant, empty. The ceremony would be small, only a select group from high society, investors, and a few of Nathaniel's discreet acquaintances. On Sarah's side, no one, not a single familiar face. No friends, no childhood memories, not even a picture of her parents. They wouldn't be there. No one who truly mattered would be. The car that took her to the church felt more like a hearse, given the shadow it carried. During the ride, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the streets pass by like scenes from a silent film. Her heart beat slowly, heavily. Her hands clenched the fabric of her dress in her lap, as if trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. When she arrived, a man from Nathaniel's staff opened the church door. He offered his hand, but she declined, stepping out on her own. The wedding march began to play. Slowly, she walked down the aisle, the guests' stares cutting through her like sharp blades. There was admiration in their eyes for her beauty, for the impeccable event, but none of them really knew who she was behind the veil. And they didn't care to know. Nathaniel waited at the altar, tall, poised, wearing a custom-tailored dark suit. His gaze was calm but unreadable. Sarah searched for something in it, a crack, a hesitation, a trace of uncertainty. But he looked carved from stone, imposing stance, controlled expression. When their eyes met, there was a brief silence between them, as if time had paused for a second. There was no passion, no tenderness, but there was no threat either, only distance. Two strangers forced to cross paths at a fork in the road. The priest began the ceremony. Traditional words, formal vows, hollow blessings for hearts in turmoil. Sarah heard everything as if underwater, the voices muffled, the faces out of focus. Then came the moment of the fateful question. Time froze. Sarah Whitmore, do you take Nathaniel Reed to be your lawful husband, promising to love him, respect him, and honor him all the days of your life? Her heart pounded, her legs trembled. For a moment all the faces disappeared, and she saw only one thing, the memory of her parents. Her mother's gentle smile, her father's steady eyes, and a silent question, is this what you want, my daughter? She didn't answer, because it wasn't what she wanted. It never was, but saying no was impossible. So with a faint voice, her world falling apart inside, she said, yes. Nathaniel responded too calmly, yes. A soft wave of applause filled the room. Rings were exchanged. The kiss was skipped. He simply took her hand gently, almost formally. And as strange as it seemed, that small gesture, which might have been meaningless, was the only sign of humanity in the entire moment. After the ceremony, they headed to an elegant reception in a private hall next to the church. Champagne, live orchestra, discreet waiters. Sarah barely touched her food. She sat at a table off to the side while Diana floated through the room like a proud socialite. Charles drank and cracked jokes with other businessmen. Nathaniel spoke to a few guests in a low voice, always keeping his polished, impenetrable posture. Amid the chatter, Sarah looked around and wondered how she had ended up there. She, a girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, who wrote poems in secret in an old notebook, was now the wife of a man 20 years older, a millionaire, a stranger, and someone whose eyes she still couldn't read. When the party was over, a driver took them to Nathaniel's house, a mansion on the edge of the city, surrounded by high walls, symmetrical gardens, and cameras in every corner. From the outside, it looked like a castle. On the inside, it was more like a museum, cold, quiet, too perfect. Nathaniel led her to a reserved wing on the second floor. When they reached the door of a large suite, he turned to her, his voice calm and direct. This is your room. You'll have privacy. Nothing will be expected of you tonight, or any other night, unless it's what you want. Sarah looked at him, startled. For the first time, she noticed something different in his gaze. There was firmness, yes, but also something subtle, as if he understood her pain, as if in some way he too was wounded. She gave a slight nod. Good night, Sarah, he said, and walked away. Alone in the luxurious suite, she sat on the edge of the bed. The room was too big, too beautiful, but empty, as if it were meant to impress, not to comfort. She slowly removed the veil, the dress, the shoes. She looked at herself in the mirror again, the same image from that morning, but with even duller eyes. She lay down with her eyes open, staring at the vaulted ceiling, and felt a chill run through her body, not from fear, but from a strange, unexpected feeling. For the first time in a long while, someone had told her she had a choice. It wasn't much, but it was more than she thought she'd find that night. The night fell like a heavy veil over the mansion, Outside, the sky seemed stitched together with thick clouds, muffling any trace of the moon or stars. The darkness felt deeper than usual, denser, more oppressive. And inside that vast house, Sarah felt like a tiny spark about to fade away. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed for over an hour. She was still wearing the silk nightgown that had been folded neatly over the armchair in the room. A wedding gift, perhaps, or just another piece in the costume of this new life. She touched the light fabric with her fingertips, as if it could anchor her to some kinder reality. But the truth was that every second there seemed to stretch. The pain she was trying to silence. Inside her, her breath was shallow. Her heart raced with every sound coming from the hallway. A creak of wood, a distant step, the clink of silverware being put away. She didn't know what to expect. After all, she was married to a man she had known for barely 2 weeks, and whose words still didn't form a clear image in her mind. Despite Nathaniel's gentle touch at the church, Sarah still carried the fear that all of this might have just been a facade, an elegant theater before the raw reality. Will he force me? The question pounded in her chest. Will he reveal himself to be like the other men in the stories? She curled up on the bed, pulling the blanket over her legs. The mansion was too silent, too cold, and in that spacious suite, lit by soft lamps, every shadow seemed to conceal an omen. She heard footsteps. They came steadily down the hallway, then stopped right outside her door. For a second, everything seemed to stop as well. The air, time, her heartbeat. A soft knock. 2 discreet taps. Then the doorknob turned slowly. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He was without his suit jacket, just a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He carried a tray in his hands, and his gaze, it was serene, respectful. No rush, no expectations, just a man carefully stepping into the space of a frightened woman. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said, his voice low, almost as if he were entering a temple. Sarah couldn't respond. She just shook her head, unsure if she was agreeing or refusing. He moved toward the small table by the bed and placed the tray there. There was a cup of tea, a small bowl of sliced fruit, and a piece of simple cake. Steam rose from the drink, filling the room with the scent of chamomile and lavender. I asked them to prepare this. I thought you might not have eaten much at the reception. She looked at the tray surprised. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt enormous. Thank you, she whispered finally. Nathaniel sat in a nearby armchair, respecting the distance between them. He stayed silent for a few seconds, staring at the floor, as if searching for the right words. Sarah, I know this marriage wasn't your choice. I know everything happened quickly and unfairly. She looked at him for the first time, truly noticing him. And for the first time, she saw something different, not just the image of a powerful man, but someone tired, deeply tired. Your uncles came to me with a proposal, he continued. I accepted because I thought I could make a difference, maybe offer security, a home, but I never wanted to take anything from you. Sarah felt a lump tighten in her throat. That was so unexpected, it almost hurt to hear. You don't need to be afraid of me, he said, with a calm so sincere it made her shiver. I won't touch you, not tonight, not tomorrow, not until you allow me to. If you allow me, this room is yours. This house is yours. Your space, your time. I just want you to feel safe here. She lowered her eyes, unable to keep a steady gaze. Tears came again, silent, warm, ashamed. It wasn't sadness, not fear. It was confusion. It was her whole body trying to understand an act of respect after so many of contempt. No one ever asked me what I wanted, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Nathaniel remained silent for a moment, then replied in a nearly broken tone, I've spent my whole life without anyone asking me either. The words hung in the air like an unexpected mirror. 2 strangers, 2 lonely souls, 2 pains that somehow recognized each other. After that, he stood up. Good night, Sarah. If you need anything, I'll be in the room next door. And then, without another word, he left, gently closing the door behind him, just as carefully as he had entered. Sarah remained there still, feeling the weight of that night begin to shift. The fear was still there, yes, but it started to share space with something new, a different silence, less suffocating, more attentive. She picked up the cup of tea and held it between her hands. The warmth filled her fingers. The scent soothed her stomach. She took a sip and for the first time since her parents' death, felt something like care, not for interest, not out of obligation, but out of choice. She fell asleep without realizing it, and that night there were no nightmares. Perhaps because someone on the other side of the wall was also awake, thinking, reassessing his own life. And maybe, just maybe, both of their loneliness had found a point of connection. The following days passed as if time had been suspended. The mansion was silent but not threatening. Sarah woke early, wandered the long hallways, explored the well-kept gardens, and gradually began to recognize the details of the place. That was now her home, although it still didn't feel like one. Nathaniel maintained a discreet routine. He left early, spent long hours in the office in the East Wing, and ate dinner alone most of the time. When they crossed paths, there was always respect, a calm greeting, a look that didn't intrude. He didn't ask questions, and strangely, that made her feel more at ease than any kind word ever could. Sarah began to observe the way he always sat at the table in the same spot, how he read the physical newspaper every morning, folding it with almost obsessive precision, how he gazed out the window for long minutes, as if nothing outside truly captured his attention. He was a methodical man, but there was something more to him. It was as if Nathaniel was always on the edge of the world, participating in things, but never fully surrendering to any of them. One afternoon, while walking through the side garden, Sarah came across the housekeeper, Mrs. Edith, an elderly and kind woman who had taken care of the house for over 20 years. The conversation started shyly, but over time the woman, perhaps relieved to have someone to talk to, opened up. "Mr. Reed, he's a good man," she said, carefully watering the rose bushes. "He just never learned how to show it. Life made him this way." Sarah looked at her with curiosity, not interrupting. His father was a harsh man, very demanding. He raised Nathaniel with an iron fist. Since he was little, he learned that crying was weakness, that smiling was a waste of time, that resting was a sin. He grew up in a world without affection, only goals, responsibilities and silence. Those words echoed in Sarah, because in a way she understood. She too knew silence. She too had been shaped by others' hands, with no space to be who she truly was. "He never had a childhood," the woman continued. "Took over his father's business while still very young. Worked like a machine. He built this empire, yes, but at what cost?" Sarah thanked the woman for the conversation and continued walking through the garden. That evening, during dinner, she looked at Nathaniel in a new way. He sat at the head of the table as usual. There was a respectful distance between them. But now she saw more than just a powerful man. She saw a man alone, and it was a loneliness that didn't scream. It hid in the way he held his utensils with precision, in how he avoided making eye contact for too long, in how he said good night before even finishing his dessert. The next day, Sarah gathered her courage and went to the library. It was a spacious room, with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, a silent refuge within a world that was already too silent. Nathaniel was there reading. "May I?" she asked, pointing to one of the armchairs nearby. He looked up, a little surprised, but nodded with a small smile. "Of course." For a few minutes they sat in silence, each with their book, keeping their distances carefully maintained. But there was something different about this silence. It wasn't empty. It was shared. After a while, Nathaniel closed his book and spoke. "Do you like to read?" Sarah smiled with a corner of her lips. "Since I was little. My father taught me to love books. He said they were secret windows to other worlds, and sometimes doors of escape when our own world gets too small." Nathaniel nodded slowly, touched by her words. "My father never read with me," he replied with a slight regret. "He said books were a distraction for people who didn't have enough work to do." She didn't respond. She just watched him. For the first time, he was telling her something about himself, without anyone asking, without expecting anything in return. "I spent years trying to please him," he continued, "but it was never enough. Not when I made my first million. Not when I was on the cover of a magazine. Not when I bought this house. He died without ever telling me he was proud of me. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest, and she understood there was a deep pain in him, but hidden beneath layers of control and self-restraint. "My father," she said, lowering her eyes. "He said pride isn't expressed with words, but with actions. That true love is seen in what we build together, not in what we say." Nathaniel remained silent for a few seconds, staring at the cold fireplace. "And what did your father build with you?" he asked. "Memories," she answered, almost in a whisper. "Small ones, but mine. And real." That night he didn't leave immediately after dinner. They sat together on the porch in silence. The stars had finally broken through the clouds, and the sky was clear. She held a cup of tea, and he held a glass of wine. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Something was transforming there, still faint, still undefined, but real. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find a bouquet of flowers on the dresser. They were white peonies, her favorites. There was a handwritten note. "I don't know much about what pleases a woman, but I'm trying to learn. Thank you for yesterday." She stared at the paper for long minutes. Her heart beat differently, still cautious, but with a small spark of warmth. It was the first gesture from someone who wasn't just fulfilling a contract, but was in some way trying to get closer. In the late afternoon, walking through the garden, Sarah saw him from afar, watching her from the porch, and on impulse she waved. He waved back, and in that brief moment, they were no longer the forced bride and the older, wealthier man. They were just two souls, trying to recognize each other. As the days went by, Sarah began to realize that life in the mansion, though still filled with emotional challenges and unresolved pain, was starting to take on a certain rhythm. She no longer woke with fear gripping her chest, at least not every day. Sometimes the sunlight would come through the window, with a gentleness that gave her a faint sense of hope, as if the new day might somehow bring something different. Nathaniel continued his reserved routine, but there was something she couldn't help but notice. Small gestures, almost invisible, that he began to make for her. He never asked directly what she needed, but somehow he always seemed to know. The morning after Sarah found the note with the flowers, Nathaniel entered the dining room with a quiet yet unfamiliar smile. It wasn't the impersonal one he used in public. This one was genuine, soft. "I noticed you were out of your favorite tea yesterday," he said as he sat at the table. "I asked the kitchen to prepare a new batch." Sarah looked at him, surprised, unsure of what to say. The chamomile and lavender tea was something she had always shared with her mother on calm afternoons. It wasn't something she had ever mentioned to Nathaniel, but somehow he knew. "Thank you," she replied, feeling an unexpected wave of gratitude. She had never imagined that such a simple gesture could mean so much. The morning continued peacefully. They had breakfast together in silence, but there was a softness in the air, a quiet understanding that, although nothing was resolved, something was beginning to take shape between them. Over the following days, those small gestures continued. When Sarah went to the library, Nathaniel would replace the book she was reading with another he thought she might enjoy, not questioning her choices, just gently suggesting an author he believed she'd like. Or during the afternoons, he would prepare a tray of fresh fruit and leave it out on the veranda, offering a subtle smile. He never touched her in any way that crossed the line of respect. And that respect, though quiet, began to create a sense of safety that Sarah hadn't felt since her parents had died. Every gesture, however small, seemed to tend to a wound in her heart. It didn't transform her instantly, but it gave her space to breathe. Nathaniel, too, began to open up slowly. On mornings when they met in the library, he would sometimes put aside the newspaper and talk about his business, not with pride, but with a disarming honesty. He shared how in the early years he had to learn how to run a company alone after his father's death. How for a long time he forgot how to live, focused only on work and chasing success without thinking about the personal cost. Sarah listened closely, sometimes silently, sometimes replying with simple words, but always trying to understand what lay behind his eyes, which now somehow seemed a little less impenetrable. One afternoon, after a quiet walk through the garden, While the leaves danced in the wind, Sarah stopped suddenly, gazing at a jasmine flower gently beginning to bloom. "I never thought I'd like a place like this," she said with a timid smile. "It's not what I imagined, but there's something beautiful here, isn't there?" Nathaniel watched her, smiling softly. He stepped closer and, almost imperceptibly, touched the flower with his fingers, reverently, as if it was sacred. "I only noticed it after you came," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "There's something alive here now that I never saw before. Something I can't touch or control, but it's real." His words lingered in the air, more meaningful than anything else he had said until that moment. Something was happening between them, something that went beyond the contract. Something that was quietly forming through daily choices, exchanged glances and unspoken words. That evening at dinner, Nathaniel sat a little closer to her, and the conversation flowed more easily than before. They began to talk about their childhoods, not the polished, neat versions we offer to strangers, but the raw, honest ones. Nathaniel spoke of the rare moments of affection with his father, how they were scarce, but immensely meaningful. Sarah talked about her mother, how she always made her feel special, even in the simplest of moments. There, between them, was an exchange of vulnerabilities, something that, without either of them realizing it, was drawing them closer, not just through respect, but through a quiet empathy they both seemed to share. Both had been wounded in different ways. Both had been left to face those wounds alone. But now, something was beginning to heal. After dinner, Sarah returned to her room. She didn't quite know what she was feeling, but something was in the air. Something that made her believe that what was happening between her and Nathaniel was no longer just a formality. It was a beginning, a possibility. She lay down and closed her eyes. In that moment, the shadows in the room didn't feel so heavy. The weight of the marriage didn't seem quite as crushing. There was something new, something Sarah hadn't expected, something that was starting to bloom. Nathaniel, in his own solitude, was also thinking about the woman who had entered his life so abruptly, without warning, without preparation. Thinking about their unexpected conversations, about the small gestures that carried more meaning than he had anticipated. He knew something was changing, something in his heart, but he didn't yet know what it meant for their future, for their lives. What he did know was this: he was willing to find out, slowly, one day at a time. As the weeks went by, Sarah began to realize that the mansion, though still vast and quiet, was gradually becoming less cold and impersonal. Small details began to appear in her daily life. Fresh flowers on the breakfast table, a cup of tea waiting when she woke up, books carefully chosen for her afternoon reading, and occasional conversations with Nathaniel where both began to open up, little by little, with a sincerity that once seemed impossible. There was still a thin line between them. The distance of a newlywed couple remained, but now it was different, softer, more human. They were no longer just two strangers thrown into the same space. They were two people who, slowly, were beginning to recognize each other. And it was on one particular night that everything changed. Or at least, began to change. Sarah woke with a start, her heart pounding. It was 1 a.m. The memory of her parents' death, always so vivid, felt even more intense than usual. She didn't know what had woken her, but the feeling of loss came crashing in with overwhelming force. She got out of bed and walked to the window, where the moonlit view of the garden brought a strange sense of comfort. Outside, everything looked calm, but inside her, the storm was just beginning. She tried to control her breathing, tried to push back the emptiness that was clawing at her chest. The silence of the house only amplified her loneliness. No matter how busy she kept herself during the day, the weight of grief was still there, taking root in every corner of her soul. Then she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. She knew who it was even before the door opened. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. He was wearing a simple robe, and though his face was serious, there was a subtle emotion in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside without saying a word. Sarah looked at him, confused, but didn't look away. Something in her chest told her not to speak, just to wait. Nathaniel walked toward her slowly, with the calm that always marked his presence. He came close, and without a word he embraced her. Not in a cold or detached way, as she might have expected. It wasn't a forced gesture. It was genuine, an embrace from someone who understood her pain, even if he didn't know how to put it into words. Sarah was surprised by the tenderness of his touch. The embrace didn't make her feel small or fragile. It made her feel held. Without words, she surrendered to the comfort of the gesture. For a few seconds, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away, as if he were somehow absorbing her pain. It was a strange feeling, the warmth of his body against hers, the steady rhythm of his breath, as though he were silently saying it was okay to feel broken, that it was okay not to have all the answers. When they pulled apart, Nathaniel finally spoke. "I know you're still carrying a lot of pain, Sarah. I don't know if there's anything I can do to help. But you don't have to go through it alone." The weight of those words touched her more deeply than any gesture he'd made before. It wasn't duty. It wasn't shallow comfort. It was the honest intention of someone who, for the first time, wasn't thinking only of himself. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say. The pain was still there, raw, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't just empty anymore. He was there, sharing her sorrow, not rushing to fix it, just offering what he could, presence. "Thank you," was all she could say, her voice muffled by emotion. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a different feeling. Something had changed in those few hours. The mansion was still enormous, but she didn't feel quite so alone. Nathaniel was there in a way she hadn't expected, and somehow that gave her strength to keep facing the weight of her grief. As the days passed, Sarah noticed a shift in how she and Nathaniel interacted. It was no longer just polite coexistence. They were growing closer, slowly, gradually, as if simply being together was enough for something new to begin taking root. One day, while they walked through the garden, Sarah felt a soft breeze brush against her face. The scent of the flowers wrapped around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something like peace. I never really saw the beauty of this place," Sarah said suddenly, gazing at the sky. "But now there's something about it that makes me want to stay." Nathaniel, by her side, looked at her with a gentle smile. He didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. He understood. He saw what she saw too. In that moment, words became unnecessary. Their eyes were enough to tell them that what they were sharing, even if still fragile, was beginning to grow into something stronger, something real. With every gesture, with every unspoken word, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for Sarah, that alone was something extraordinary. And so, through quiet moments and small kindnesses, an unexpected connection began to blossom. Sarah didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future. Because standing beside Nathaniel, she was beginning to understand something essential, even in the midst of pain. Something beautiful could still be born. Winter arrived gently, covering the mansion's gardens with a layer of crisp air and golden leaves. The afternoons grew shorter, the nights quieter. The mansion, once so rigid and impersonal, began to take on a different shape, warmer, more alive, more human. And at the heart of it all was Sarah and Nathaniel. They hadn't touched beyond subtle gestures, but somehow something between them deepened with each shared conversation, with every respected silence, with every quiet act of care that emerged without ceremony. That night the mansion was especially still. The staff had left early, and dinner had been served just for the two of them. Simple food, the soft clinking of cutlery, the warmth of the fireplace in the main room. Everything seemed to conspire toward a different kind of moment, more intimate, more real. Nathaniel suggested a glass of wine. Sarah nodded in agreement. They sat side by side in front of the fire, where two glasses were poured with quiet precision. The orange glow from the flames reflected on the glass, casting soft shadows across their faces. For a while, the only sound was the crackling of burning wood. Sarah stared at the fire, thoughtful, her knees drawn up under a light blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Nathaniel seemed more at ease than usual, leaning back in his chair. holding his glass between his fingers. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, his voice low. Sarah turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. She nodded. "What were your parents like?" The question came without warning, but with unexpected tenderness. Sarah swallowed hard. No one had asked her that since she'd lost them. Her uncles had never brought it up, as if ignoring the pain would somehow erase it. She took a deep breath. "They were kind. My father had big, rough hands, but he cooked better than anyone I knew. He made bread every Sunday just to see me smile. And my mother, she used to hum while brushing my hair. She always said the world could be cruel, but we didn't have to be." Nathaniel listened quietly, his eyes steady on her, no rush, no judgment, as if listening alone was a gift. "I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah," he said, with a sincerity that came from somewhere deep within. "Losing the ones we love. It's like being left in a world that doesn't recognize us anymore." Sarah nodded slowly. His words weren't just surface-level sympathy. It felt like he carried his own loss, maybe not of someone, but of some part of himself. "They died in a car accident," she said, her voice trembling. "It was quick. They told me they didn't feel any pain, but the ones left behind felt everything." Nathaniel stayed silent for a few moments, then took a sip of wine and stared at the fire, thoughtful. "I drifted apart from my father before he died," he confessed. "I spent years trying to be what he wanted. It was never enough. When he got sick, I was too tired to keep trying. He died without a single moment of reconciliation, and I never forgave myself for that." Sarah looked at him differently now, for the first time. She didn't see Nathaniel as a powerful, untouchable man, but as someone who had also been wounded, someone who carried shadows of his own. "You did what you could," she said gently. He looked away briefly, as if absorbing her words. "And your uncles?" he asked. "Were they cruel to you?" Sarah bit her lower lip. The memories came back like splinters. "They didn't beat me, but they ignored me, saw me as a burden. I was just a moral obligation. They used me to gain favors, to keep up appearances. And when the chance came to get rid of me, they didn't even hesitate." Nathaniel tensed. His eyes darkened for a moment. "They had no right," he said firmly. "No one does." Sarah was surprised by the intensity of his reaction. There was anger in his voice, not at her, but for her. Anger at what she had endured. And strangely, it warmed something inside her. After so long being silenced, it felt like for the first time, someone was outraged on her behalf. "You didn't deserve that, Sarah," he added, his voice softer now. She looked away, the tears welling up in her eyes. She felt vulnerable but strangely safe. There was something in the way Nathaniel spoke to her, as if he were telling her she mattered, that her pain was real, that he saw her. He leaned a little closer, still respectful of the space between them, but with the quiet presence of someone who wanted to be there, fully present. "I know the way things started between us wasn't fair," he said. "But from the very first day, I promised myself I wouldn't be one more person who hurt you." Sarah took a deep breath. His words stirred something deep inside her. Her walls were beginning to come down, and in that moment, by the fire, with the scent of wood smoke in the air and the shadows dancing around them, she decided to take a small step. She reached out and gently touched the back of his hand. Nathaniel froze for a second, then slowly turned his palm upward, wrapping his fingers around hers with care. It was a soft touch, but for both of them it was everything. A bridge between two worlds that had once seemed impossible to reconcile. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, as if finally there was nothing urgent left to say, only to feel. And in that moment, in front of the fire, with hearts still hurting but a little more open, Sarah and Nathaniel took their first true step toward each other, not out of obligation, not out of relief, but out of choice. A quiet choice, but a powerful one. The days that followed the night by the fireplace were different. Something had shifted between Sarah and Nathaniel, something quiet, yet irreversible. The touch of their hands, the shared warmth, the revealed vulnerability, all of it had left marks that could no longer be ignored. They weren't just signs of growing closer. They were small declarations of trust, spoken without words. That morning, Sarah woke with a different feeling in her chest. It wasn't exactly happiness. There was still pain, fear, and too many memories, but there was lightness, a kind of truce, perhaps. She opened the curtains and let the cold winter light pour into the room, bathing the furniture in a soft golden hue. When she came down for breakfast, she found Nathaniel already at the table. He wasn't reading a newspaper, as usual, but a book. When he saw her, he closed it gently and gave her a slight smile. It was restrained, but genuine, the kind of smile one gives only when they're truly present. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, offering her a cup of tea. "I did," she replied, taking a seat. "And you?" "Better than I have in weeks," he said with a sincerity that surprised her. They ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence full of understanding, like two allies who no longer needed to prove anything to each other. Later that day, Nathaniel surprised her with a question. "Would you like to go out with me today?" Sarah looked at him, slightly startled. "Out where?" "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Something I've never shown anyone before." She hesitated, but there was something in his tone, a kind of calm urgency, that touched her. She nodded gently. They left in the late afternoon, just as the sky began to turn shades of orange and violet. Nathaniel drove himself, something unusual for someone like him. The car followed tree-lined roads, moving away from the city center and into older, simpler areas. "Where are we going?" she asked, curious. "To the place where it all began," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "Where my empire was born, and where maybe a part of me was left behind." His answer made Sarah quiet. She didn't respond, just watched the changing scenery through the window. They arrived at an old brick warehouse with tall windows, surrounded by twisted trees and an empty parking lot. Next to it stood a small, two-story building with a faded facade. "This used to be my first office," Nathaniel said, stepping out of the car. "And over there, that smaller space, that's where I lived. One room and a small living area. Just me, a desk, and mountains of bills." They entered the warehouse, now turned into a kind of personal memorial. In the center stood a large wooden table, still marked by time. Scattered across it were old papers, technical drawings, and black and white photos. "I started with metal parts exports," he explained, walking through the space like someone revisiting a forgotten chapter of their life. "I worked through the night, survived on coffee and silence. My father used to say that if I wanted respect, I had to build something no one could tear down." Sarah walked beside him, absorbing each word, each detail. What she saw wasn't the millionaire from the headlines, but the man behind it all, man who had started with grease-stained hands and fear in his eyes. "I grew up believing love was a waste of time," he confessed, stopping in front of an old photograph. "That vulnerability was weakness. And for a long time I lived with anger, always in a rush, thinking that if I earned enough, the emptiness would disappear." He turned to her, his gaze steady but damp. "But it wasn't money that helped me sleep this week. It was you." Sarah felt her chest tighten. That statement, so direct, so honest, struck her in a way she hadn't expected. It was the first time anyone had said something like that to her. Not out of interest, not out of pity, but because it was true. "I don't know who I am beside you yet," she said cautiously. "I'm still trying to figure out who I am, without fear." "I am too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And maybe we can figure that out together." On the way back, the silence was comforting. She looked out the window, but her mind was full of the images she'd just seen. The young man bent over a worn desk, trying to prove something to an absent father, and the older man, who now admitted he didn't have all the answers. Something inside her began to shift. It wasn't just gratitude. It was affection. It was connection. That evening, Nathaniel invited her to dinner, not in the formal dining room, but in the kitchen, a space he almost never used, but that now felt warmer, more intimate. They sat at an old wooden table with candles lit and simple dishes served. "This is where my mother taught me how to make tea," he said with a rare smile. On the few days when she felt well enough, she was sweet, but she faded too quickly. After she was gone, everything hardened. Sarah watched him in silence. She felt strangely close to this man who, little by little, was unveiling his own pain with the same tenderness with which he left. Fresh flowers at her bedside. "Sometimes I feel like my story was written for me," she said finally. "Like I never got to choose anything. Like everything was decided by someone else." Nathaniel met her eyes with quiet strength. "But now, Sarah, you get to rewrite it. Page by page, day by day. And if you'll let me, I want to be there with you." She didn't answer right away, but she reached across the table, and he took her hand, just like that night by the fire. It wasn't an ending, but it was most definitely a beginning. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of quiet. Not the oppressive silence that had once filled the mansion, but a comfortable stillness full of meaning. Sarah and Nathaniel had slowly built a life together grounded in respect, attentiveness, and mutual care. Nothing was rushed, nothing was demanded. She no longer feared walking through the hallways. She had the freedom to organize the books in the library, to choose the dinner menu, to quietly redecorate corners of the house that once felt untouched. The mansion was no longer just where they lived. It was beginning to feel like home. Nathaniel had changed too. He no longer spent all his time holed up in his office. He joined her for morning walks in the garden, insisted on being present at lunch and dinner, and had learned to listen more than speak. Sometimes he would simply sit beside her and watch the fire in the hearth, silent, but fully present, and yet something between them remained suspended. A growing affection, a deepening admiration, but no gesture that crossed the line between companionship and love. Until that night. It was a cold night, and rain tapped steadily against the stained glass windows of the mansion. Sarah walked barefoot through the hallways, searching for a forgotten book in the reading room. She wore a wool robe over her pajamas, her hair loosely pinned back, still damp from her bath. As she turned the corner, she saw him. Nathaniel stood in front of the fireplace, alone, a glass of wine in hand, his eyes lost in the flames. He wore a dark linen shirt, no jacket, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. In that light, he looked younger, softer, more vulnerable. "I couldn't sleep," she said, stopping in the doorway. Nathaniel looked at her gently. "Neither could I." Sarah walked over and sat on the sofa facing him. The sound of rain. "It reminds me of my parents' house," she said softly. "We'd sit by the window wrapped in blankets. My mother always made hot chocolate. And my father, he'd make up stories on the spot just to make me laugh." Nathaniel smiled as if he could see the scene in his mind. "I never had that," he said. "I remember the rain, something that kept me from going to work. Never as an invitation to feel comfort." Sarah looked at him with tenderness. There was still so much of him left to discover, so many gaps, so much pain hidden behind years of control and isolation. She stood and walked over to the fireplace. Sitting on the soft rug close to the warmth, without saying a word, Nathaniel joined her. They sat side by side, legs crossed, shoulders nearly touching. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Have you ever truly loved someone?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought I did. A few times. But now I see it was more about trying to fill a void than about sharing anything real. It was loneliness in disguise." Sarah took a deep breath, letting his words settle inside her. "And you?" he asked. "Never," she said honestly. "I was too young when everything fell apart. Since then, I've lived in the shadows of other people's choices. I never chose love. I was never truly chosen." Nathaniel looked at her, and the look in his eyes had changed. It wasn't just affection anymore. It was something deeper, a shared pain, a quiet admiration, a desire held back. "Sarah," he said, voice almost breaking, "I never planned for this. I never thought I could look at someone like this, so intensely, after everything." She looked back at him, and their eyes locked in a long, suspended moment. There was no rush, no fear, just presence. Nathaniel leaned in slowly. He touched her face with his fingertips, as if asking for permission to be there. She closed her eyes, not in surrender but in acceptance. The kiss came like the soft closing of an old door that had long been left open. Slow, respectful, full of everything they had never said aloud. It was more than desire. It was healing. It was a meeting. When they pulled away, he cupped her face in his hands and said, voice steady but full of emotion, I love you, Sarah." She felt those words like a whisper straight to the heart. It wasn't an impulsive declaration. It was a confirmation of everything he had been saying in silence, gesture by gesture. Sarah took a deep breath, fighting back a wave of emotions. I think I love you too," she said honestly. "I'm still learning what that means. But what I feel, it's real." Nathaniel pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. In that moment, it was as if two broken worlds had finally aligned, not in perfection, but in truth. The night continued in silence. They didn't go beyond that kiss. They didn't need to. What they shared was more than physical. It was an unspoken promise that from that moment on, everything would be different. And it was. The days following that night seemed to carry a different glow. It wasn't something visible or obvious. The house was the same, the furniture untouched, the daily habits still quiet. But there was a new presence within the walls of the mansion, a subtle warmth that filled once empty spaces, a quiet energy that only comes when two hearts have truly found one another. Sarah woke up smiling, even without realizing it. There was a lightness in her steps, a sense of hope in the way she set the breakfast table or watered the plants in the side garden. Even the way she looked out the window had changed. No longer with the eyes of someone waiting to be rescued, but of someone beginning to grow roots. Nathaniel, too, seemed more human, less guarded, more present. He spent fewer hours in his office, cancelled video meetings to have lunch with her, invited her for walks in the chilly afternoons. His laughter, once rare and reserved, now came freely, especially when Sarah shared childhood memories or made faces at overly fancy dishes. The bond between them no longer needed to be explained. It was felt. One morning, as they prepared breakfast together, she peeling fruit, he trying to get the coffee measurements right, Nathaniel said something that stayed with her. "You know what I realized? This house has always been too big. I filled it with art, expensive furniture, everything money could buy. But it only became a home after you arrived." Sarah stopped what she was doing. Her hands froze for a moment. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from gratitude, from feeling seen. She smiled. "I used to think home was made of walls, but now I understand it's made of glances, of shared silence, of hands that don't let go." Nathaniel stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her. The hug was full, long, deep. They weren't in a hurry. They had time. In the days that followed, small changes began to happen around the house. Nothing planned, nothing grand, just signs that something new was taking shape. Sarah asked to open the library windows each day, letting the air flow freely. She bought colorful blankets and new cushions for the living room, replacing its rigidity with warmth. Nathaniel didn't just approve it, he helped. He went with her to a local shop to pick out scented candles, laughed with her while carrying too many bags, sampled cakes in small, humble cafes. It was a world he had never belonged to, but now it made sense. One especially cold night, they decided to cook together. Nathaniel, clearly out of his element with pans and wooden spoons, let Sarah guide him, who laughed at his attempts to cut vegetables evenly. "I think I'll stick to running companies," Dundu, he joked, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. "And I'll stick to caring for hearts," she replied, drawing a genuine laugh from him. They ate in the kitchen, sitting side by side, sharing one plate. And that night, something became even clearer. They were no longer just adjusting to each other. They were building something, together. Nathaniel began inviting her to take part in decisions about the house. He asked for her opinion on a new wing being remodeled. He showed her blueprints, documents, and was surprised by her eye for detail. "You notice things I never would have seen," he said, impressed. "Maybe because I've lived in places where no one saw anything at all," she replied, not bitterly, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned to look beneath the surface. He looked at her for a long time. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." Sarah lowered her eyes, shy, but her heart swelled at those words. Not from pride, but because for the first time, someone saw her strength with tenderness. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the mansion was no longer a place of marble and silence. It was a home, with soft music in the afternoons, with laughter in the kitchen, with books left open on chairs, with clothes drying on the veranda. with the smell of fresh-baked cake drifting down the halls. One night Sarah sat on the porch with Nathaniel. They were wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea, listening to the sounds of crickets and wind. She rested her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd be here," she said honestly. "When all this began, all I wanted was to run away." "So did I," he confessed. "Run from myself, from who I'd become. And now?" Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes glowing. "Now all I want is to stay." Sarah didn't say anything. She simply smiled and squeezed his hand tightly. There, in the stillness of the night, she understood that her story, once full of pain, loss and imposition, had become something else. It had become choice. It had become presence. It had become love. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a burden, no longer just a name on a piece of paper. She was a wife, a partner, a confidante, and finally, she was herself. Time passed quietly, as it often does when days are filled with presence, shared silences, and small gestures of affection. Sarah now walked through the house with a different light in her eyes. She was no longer just the young woman marked by pain and lack of choice. She was blooming, and with each step, she left behind old versions of herself, the ones shaped by fear and guilt. Nathaniel, in turn, was living his own transformation. The man who once carried the weight of the world on his shoulders now walked with ease. His eyes smiled more often, his touch had become spontaneous, and his presence, once grand and imposing, was now gentle, almost quiet, like someone who had finally found rest in another heart. And it was during this new chapter that something unexpected, yet deeply symbolic, happened. Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization came on a grey autumn morning, while she was tending to the freshly planted flowers in the garden. She felt a wave of lightheadedness, a nausea that felt different from before. Over the next few days, other signs appeared, and her body began whispering a new truth. She didn't say anything right away. She wanted to be sure, to understand it on her own before sharing it with the world, even if that world was just Nathaniel. When the pregnancy was finally confirmed by the family doctor, she sat on the porch bench for a long time, gazing up at the sky. She was pregnant. A child, a new cycle, a new beginning. There was no fear, only reverence, only stillness. There was something ancestral about that moment, as if her lineage, her story and her pain were all being rewritten in silence. That night she prepared a simple dinner. She didn't ask for help. She wanted it to feel intimate, special. She made Nathaniel's favorite dish, lit a few candles, and placed a small box on the table tied with a blue ribbon. When he arrived, surprised by the scene, she simply smiled and said, "Today is an important day." Nathaniel sat down, curious but respectful as always. The meal was light, filled with glances and quiet smiles. At the end, Sarah gently slid the box toward him, her eyes sparkling with something he had never seen before. He opened it. Inside, a tiny pair of knitted baby booties. Nathaniel went silent. For a few seconds he said nothing. He just held the booties in his trembling hands, like something sacred. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were full of tears. "You're—" "Yes," she said, gently interrupting. Nathaniel stood and walked to her. He knelt in front of her and rested his forehead against hers. "You've given me everything, Sarah," he whispered. "A family, a home, a heart I didn't even know I still had." The weeks that followed were wrapped in a different kind of calm. The pregnancy stirred deep emotions, but also deepened the bond between them. Nathaniel, more present than ever, insisted on being part of everything, from doctor's appointments to picking out wallpaper for the baby's room. Sarah watched it all with tenderness. The man who was once feared for his coldness now read parenting books, decorated the nursery with animals, and caressed her belly with a reverence that melted her. "It's a boy," the doctor announced one sunny afternoon. Sarah held Nathaniel's hand, and they both smiled like children. The gender didn't matter. What mattered was what that child represented: rebirth, a new beginning, a chapter written by two hands together. When the day of the birth arrived, the sky was clear, the air warm, and the garden in full bloom, as if nature itself knew what was about to unfold. Sarah went into labor at sunset. Nathaniel, nervous but calm, stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, breathing with her, whispering words of encouragement she would never forget. "You're strong, my love. You've been through so much. We're almost there. I'm here. I'll always be here." The pain was intense, but Sarah felt a strength rising from deep within, perhaps from the women who came before her, or maybe from her own ability to turn pain into life. And then, at 6:27 p.m., Gabriel was born. His cry echoed through the house like a new song, an announcement, a miracle. Nathaniel cried. He held his son in his arms with awe. Sarah, exhausted, watched them through teary eyes. "He's," she began. "Ours," Nathaniel finished, looking at her. "Entirely ours." In the days that followed, the house transformed once again. Now it echoed with the cries of a baby, smelled of milk, and moved to the gentle rhythm of lullabies. Tiny clothes hung in the sun, bottles were sterilized, diapers were changed with tender hands. But more than that, there was something pulsing in every corner, belonging. Nathaniel was a different man, patient, attentive, loving. He slept less, worked less, but smiled more. He was alive. "I never imagined love could feel so simple," he said one night as Sarah rocked Gabriel in her arms. "Because now it's not about control," she replied. "It's about surrender." And he nodded in agreement. The mansion, once a symbol of power and status, had become the quiet backdrop to a love story born from ashes. Not perfect, not planned, but deeply real. Sitting in the nursing chair, Sarah gazed at her son and felt that everything had been worth it. Every pain, every imposition, every night filled with fear, she had overcome, not by force, but by love. And now that love had a name, a scent, tiny hands. Gabriel was the bridge between everything she once was and everything she was becoming. And Nathaniel was the miracle she never saw coming. It was morning when Sarah opened her eyes and saw the soft light filtering through the bedroom curtains. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine, the very jasmine she had planted weeks before Gabriel's birth, now in full bloom, perfuming the air. Beside her, Nathaniel was still asleep, his hair tousled, one arm stretched across the empty bed where the baby had slept. A few hours earlier, Sarah got up gently, crossed the room in silence, and walked over to the crib. Gabriel was sleeping peacefully, his tiny fists closed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of small miracles. She ran her fingers through his fine hair and smiled. Every detail of that scene would have been unthinkable just months ago. The young woman once forced to say yes at the altar was now a mother. She was loved. She was seen, not because someone told her what to do, but because, in the midst of chaos, she had found her voice again. Downstairs, the mansion was no longer silent. The housekeeper was humming while making breakfast. The windows were all open, letting in the light without asking permission. The greenhouse plants looked greener, the flowers more alive, and even the paintings on the walls seemed to tell a different story, one of rebuilding. Nathaniel came down shortly after, holding the baby in his arms, dressed in a soft blue pajama set. His face held the serene expression of someone who had found something they never even knew they were looking for. When he saw Sarah, he walked over and kissed her forehead. "He looks like you when he sleeps," he said tenderly. "And he has your nose," she replied, laughing. They walked out to the porch together. The sun warmed their skin gently. The world seemed to breathe in the same rhythm as they did now. They sat in silence, Gabriel resting in Nathaniel's arms. And in that seemingly ordinary morning, something settled deep inside Sarah. It was as if the past, with all its pain, its losses, its absences, had finally found a place to rest. "You know," she said, staring at the horizon, "for a long time, I believed my life was like a river current I could never escape from, that I only existed through the will of others. But that's not true. It never was. I just didn't know." Nathaniel listened quietly, holding Gabriel close. "You rewrote your story, Sarah," he said, "with courage, with love, and you taught me to do the same." She smiled, her eyes full of emotion. "You gave me space. You gave me time. You gave me peace. And you gave me everything," he replied, eyes misty. A son, a home, a second chance to be a man, not just a businessman, a human being. Sarah took his hand, firmly, with certainty. "Promise me you'll never forget who we were?" she asked. "Not just now, while everything feels beautiful and light, but when the hard days come, when the world tightens again, when we stumble. Because we will, Nathaniel. That's life. I promise," he said, his voice steady. "I promise to keep choosing you, choosing us, even on the hard days, especially on them." She nodded. And in that moment, with no grand gestures, no witnesses, no shiny rings or marble altars, they made their truest vows. Not the ones forced upon them on their wedding day, but the ones born from shared experience, transformed pain, and truth spoken with the whole heart. Eternal promises, sealed not by tradition, but by love. That afternoon, Nathaniel took Sarah and Gabriel to the countryside, a small property less than an hour from the mansion. A quiet place surrounded by trees, with a simple house, a wooden porch, and a fruit orchard in the back. "I bought this land many years ago," he said. "I thought I'd build a retreat here, but I never had the time. No, I think it was just waiting for you." Sarah walked barefoot through the grass. She breathed in the smell of the earth, felt the wind in her hair, and the warmth of her son nestled against her chest. This was life. Simple, real life. Whole life. "And what do you plan to do with all this now?" she asked, looking at him with tenderness. "I want to build a place where Gabriel can grow up free," he replied. "Where we can plant, harvest, teach, where we never forget what really matters." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "Then let's build it together." And in that golden twilight, as the sun sank behind the trees and the sky turned to amber, Sarah knew that the pain of the past had been transformed, that every humiliation, every loss, every tear had led to this moment. Nothing had been in vain. Nothing would be forgotten. And even if the world turned harsh again, and it would, she now knew who she was. She knew what she was worth. She knew she was no longer alone there. The old story of Sarah came to an end, but a new one was just beginning. Sarah's story isn't just about an arranged marriage. It's not just about a cold mansion, an older businessman, or a loveless contract. It's about how the pain meant to extinguish us sometimes ends up setting us on fire. Sarah walked into that house as a broken young woman, voiceless, choiceless, futureless. She carried on her back the weight of loss, abandonment, the loneliness of someone who had never truly been seen. And for a while she believed that would be all there was. But time, that quiet craftsman, began to shape something in her no one expected. Because Sarah wasn't molded just by her circumstances. She was refined by the small daily decisions she chose to make, to keep walking, to breathe, to observe, to listen, and most of all, not to harden her heart. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed to be her complete opposite, rigid, powerful, untouchable. But deep down he too carried wounds. Wounds that success couldn't heal. Wounds of a boy who grew up without affection, without time, without warmth. Their connection wasn't a fairy tale. It was slow, filled with awkward silences, diverted glances, cautious steps. But it was real, and that's why it was transformative. Because healing doesn't come from how fast love arrives, it comes from how deeply it chooses to stay. Every gesture Nathaniel offered Sarah, the tea, the respect, the safe silence, was a brick in the building of something new. And every word, every smile she gave him, was a key unlocking doors he thought were closed forever. What started as a prison became a home. What was once a contract turned into care. What seemed impossible became a family. And maybe that's the most powerful miracle of all, when pain doesn't bury us, it plants us. Sarah blossomed, not because someone saved her, but because she dared to love even after everything. Because she decided her story wouldn't end where others thought it should. She rewrote her destiny with trembling hands, but steady ones. And in the end, what was once forced became choice. What was imposed became freedom. What was fear became a miracle. If this story touched your heart, then take a deep breath and ask yourself for a moment, how many times have you felt trapped in something you didn't choose? How often have you carried pain that wasn't yours, silenced your own desires, or tried to survive in a place where no one truly saw you. The truth is, many stories, just like Sarah's, begin in darkness, in fear, in the absence of choice. But that doesn't mean they have to end that way. Because sometimes all we need is a safe space, someone who doesn't impose, but listens, a time that doesn't rush, but respects, and a love that doesn't rescue, but walks beside us. Sarah reminds us that even the saddest pages can be rewritten, that real love doesn't invade, it waits, it cares, it transforms. And you, what part of your story is still waiting to be rewritten? If this story stirred something inside you, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. And subscribe to Stories That Heal for more stories like this one. Stories where pain becomes strength, loss blooms into love, and life finds, in the unexpected, its rebirth.